why I jumped on connecting with him on LinkedIn again. So going back a little bit in time, I wanted to share a little bit about Peter from a very personal perspective. I met him in February of 2006. I went to Florida to take a CSM class, and certainly it was something that Jody Berg, who's with us tonight, had suggested and said, do you want to go? And I said, of course I do. So it was when I was first embarking on my journey with Scrum and with Agile. I was working on a project then for eFunds at the time, which was in the process of acquiring wildcard systems, and Peter was with wildcard systems. So all these things kind of came together. But when I got to Sunrise, what was really interesting and cool about the whole thing, besides finally being able to see Scrum in the real, is that there was such a buzz. I mean, there was such enthusiasm for Scrum and Agile, and that was in large part, if not all part, to Peter, who as a VP with the company was the consummate servant leader. I mean, he's just was so, he embraced Scrum and Agile as a way of transforming that business and making lives better in the process by bringing the values and principles to life in that company. So I got to work with Peter for a couple of years. We were rolling out Scrum kind of globally for eFunds, and he helped train, he helped mentor. He was the person that was like solidly behind us, making sure that we were making great decisions for all the right reasons as we continued to work through that transformation or attempted rollout. I will have to say that, you know, we were, as eFunds, we were also acquired in the process, and that changed a lot of things for us. But, you know, the experience was great. For those of you in the Twin Cities, you know Red Hunter, you probably know Lonnie Weaver-Johnson, you've heard of Brian Stallings from Solutions IQ. All of these people, including Peter, were ones that we were really very, I guess, I can only say the gratitude that I feel for the experience that I had is in large parts of Peter and the team that he had created in Wildcard Systems. So, and as a friend, he has been so kind as to even bring me shekels from Israel so that I could give them to a friend of mine who collects currency. So, I mean, it's just a very caring, thoughtful person. And I cannot say enough about him as a talented speaker, as a trainer, as a consultant, as an advocate for all these things that we love about Agile and Scrum. So I'm sure many of you have seen him at gatherings. He's volunteered, he's been, you know, a speaker, a presenter, and recently you may have seen him even at the gathering in the Twin Cities in 2018 in our Blizzard, where he was with his big Orange Square partner, Hubert Schmidt. So with that, I want to say thanks again for his generosity, his time sharing with us, and this I think his experience and his thoughts on Agile and Scrum is in other industries and services is going to be really interesting for all of us. So with that, Peter will get into his presentation. There will be times when we'll stop and give people the ability to ask questions. I hope you take that opportunity. And then at the very, very end, we'll have breakout rooms for anybody wants to stick around and share from a social perspective. And Peter will stay as well. So with that, please.
Cheryl, one really quick thing. We are recording the session. Just want to let everybody know.
Thanks, Cheryl, for that reminder.
And I may possibly turn off your videos and audio if that happened to come on, just to make sure that we have good network.
So with that, anyway, please welcome my friend and our guest, Peter Borsella.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you very much. You know, as we were talking before the beginning of this time, I was concerned that Cheryl was going to set the bar a little too high. My objective is that by the time this session is over, you can look back on it and simply say, you know, it was a good use of my time. So I certainly hope that this is something that can be beneficial to those of you who decided to make that time to be here tonight. Again, Peter Borsella. I am still in South Florida. I'm connecting to you from Pompano Beach, and wishing you all warmth and safety during this particularly nasty situation, right, that so much of the country is enduring. I view this as an honor and a privilege to join you, particularly since this is only the second gathering of this group. So again, much appreciate you taking the time to be here. Just a couple of comments about, again, where I'm coming from. I'm here actually coming from two different companies. So as the president of Winnow Management, we focus on bringing agility and Scrum primarily, but not exclusively, to the software world. And as CEO of Big Orange Square, my business partner, Hubert Smits, and I, we bring agility and Scrum to industry, the creation of physical products. And I mentioned the two because between these two companies, I've had the good fortune to experience a wide range of environments where people are trying to understand how to become more agile. Now, before going too far with that topic, even though we are going to have some opportunities for questions and discussions, please feel comfortable using the chat feature. Now, I'm not going to be looking at the chat feature. It's too distracting for me, and I get distracted very easily. But Cheryl and Angela will be monitoring the chat window. If there's a clarification that's needed, such as something I'm saying that doesn't make sense, or you miss a word, those types of chats that you request will be addressed immediately. Other questions will be held for later. So Cheryl, Angela, please feel comfortable interrupting me verbally, audibly, for any clarifications that might come up. I'd appreciate that. So why do organizations seek to become more agile? You know, if we were in the physical space together where we could look each other in the eye, you know, we'd probably shout out some ideas about why organizations are looking to become more agile. And I appreciate Cheryl mentioning, you know, that work-life experience, job satisfaction in a way, right? It is part of this. But for many of the companies I've worked with, they're primarily looking for agile as a way to get their products out the door. Not just faster, but just out the door and finally get something completed. Now, many of you seen this introduction to the Agile Manifesto for software delivery. This is just a snippet from it. But notice this statement here represents a value system, right? If you've seen the Agile Manifesto before, you know it talks about how we value something like individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Not to indicate we don't need the things on the right, like processes and tools, of course we do, but it's expressing what we value. In a way, it's a philosophy. It's certainly a way of thinking. And under that agile way of thinking, that agile umbrella, if you will, there are many practices. Now, Scrum is many things, but first, it's an extension of that agile thinking. It's an agile practice. Many of you have been engaged in Scrum for maybe some form of Scrum for many years already. And at the very least, you most likely have heard about agility and Scrum. But if you've been exposed to this for any amount of time, haven't we experienced and heard countless verifications that Scrum works in software? I mean, there's no longer any debate about Scrum working in software. That train has left the station. And isn't there even an abundance of belief that Agile is actually for software? I mean, even the PMI, the Project Management Institute, refers to their disciplined Agile delivery approach as a software development framework. Again, Scrum is many things. it's a practice, but at its foundation, our interpretation is that there are two basic expectations of operating in a Scrum-based environment. First of all, it's team-based. Second, it's empirical from empiricism. I was originally a biology major, so I had to take a lot of science classes, of course, and we learned about empiricism, the scientific method. And with empiricism, you have a theory about something, but the only way you can prove out the theory is to test it. So Scrum is a way of testing our theories about delivery. So team-based and empirical. Now, you might have been immersed for this for so many years, it doesn't seem to be impressive, but those two thoughts are quite revolutionary. So with the short time we have together, we're going to venture beyond software, look at some other examples. Now, as mentioned, I've had the good fortune of working in a variety of environments, all experiencing the positive impacts of Agile and Scrum. I've had the chance to work with a marketing firm, an automotive company, a company that makes braking systems for trucks, a large consulting firm where their auditing division wanted to become more agile and deploy Scrum, a company that makes computer chips, government agencies, education, ministries, construction, human resources, and others. And there's a common misunderstanding I've encountered while speaking to a few other trainers and coaches when the topic of Scrum outside of software comes up. And here's what it sounds like. This is what I hear from others. Well, if you're not building software and you're interested in using Scrum, what are you worried about? Just use Scrum. Simple. Well, our experience has shown that's not a deeply thoughtful response, and there's little or no consideration for the specifics of the product in question. And our experience has shown that non-software organizations that attempt to move to Scrum by just using Scrum, they struggle, and sometimes to the point where they give up. So let's home in on one particularly challenging space as an example. Industry. Physical product delivery will be our example today. A company wants to make new earbuds. Right? Now, keep in mind, I believe there are these two foundational aspects of Scrum that need to be considered thoughtfully if we're going to venture beyond software, teams, and empiricism. So first, what does it mean to be team-based in this environment? This is a classical V model structure. Historically, our teams were reflecting such a model. Some of you have worked in environments such as this. And you can see the V, right, starts when one end of the V goes down to the bottom and then goes back up the other. So in the top left, what do we start with? Well, of course, requirements. And then those requirements need to be broken out into different areas that need to be addressed in order for a fully integrated product. So like mechanical, electrical, software, for example. And then within those specific areas, there's work done to break down even further the specifications for mechanical and software, let's say. And then when you get down to the bottom left, there's the effort to actually create those components, and it could be across multiple teams. So when you move to the right along the bottom, there needs to be some integration activities. So all of the mechanical, let's say, or all of the software can come together. And then you start moving up the right side, and we have the massive integration where everything starts coming together. And of course, the expectation is that we have a functioning product. And we verify that through integration testing. And that sets us up to work with supply chain and manufacturing so that we can indeed mass produce this. Now, please note that what is assumed first, the requirements, the initial effort to define what's needed, that's often not validated until near the end. So if we have integration problems, they're showing up late, and change is going to be hard and expensive. So integration problems that force us to make change will be challenging enough, but what about changes from the marketplace that would cause us to rethink some of the aspects of what we're building? Really hard, really expensive. Now, this doesn't mean that the model doesn't work for some organizations. But even if it works, if you will, they will still see costly integration problems showing up late. And the cost of those problems might be acceptable, such as this example from NASA, right? The US National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Now here you can see how the V model plays out in practice, with the different columns moving left to right, representing the different phases of product development and delivery. You've all seen examples like this in various shapes and forms. So what would our teams look like in this model? Now, most likely, they're going to be component teams. Teams of component specialists that need to hand off their work to other teams of component specialists. And eventually, all those pieces will be integrated together, sometimes months after work has been completed. And again, we're back to some of the risk associated with doing that. So here's what our teams might look like. Whole teams of programmers, whole teams of testers, whole teams of architects, etc. But if we want to address the risks presented in the classical delivery structure, we need to carefully create our teams that will work on the product at hand. And you've probably already heard the Agile analogy of wanting a full slice of product. Right? Don't slice horizontally, slice vertically, and people have used the analogy of a slice of cake, right? You want the whole slice of cake. Well, coming from an Italian heritage, I'd rather talk about lasagna myself. Now, in this example, using lasagna, if I went to my favorite Italian restaurant and ordered lasagna for dinner, I want a whole slice delivered, not a wet noodle. And then I wait for the server to bring me some sauce. And then I wait for some cheese. And then all the components have to be assembled and verified. But the noodle's already cold by the time that happens. So I need to go back for some rework, et cetera, et cetera. No, of course not. I mean, it's silly, right, to even consider that. I want the whole integrated experience. And we can come closer to that whole experience when we, instead of component teams, create feature teams. Feature teams. Now, our feature teams are composed of cross-functional developers, using that generic term indicating whatever skill is needed. So please take note of that, right? A developer in our Agile environment is not restricted to a software engineer. Testers are developers, database administrators are developers, mechanical engineers are developers, translators, artists, editors, auditors, etc. They're all developers if they're part of the delivery team. So a software feature team, let's come back to that. If we want to deliver a full slice, we're looking for a team with the skills present to realize the full value chain from delivery start to finish. product design and architecture, coding and configuration, verification, lots of different types of tests, deployment, support, etc. Now remember, you see, I'm saying remember, but I'm making a presumption here that some of you are old enough to remember this isn't how teams have traditionally been structured. Remember, our architects were separated, but now we have them in our teams working on emergent architecture with their teammates. Remember, our testers were separated, sometimes even outsourced, sometimes even in a different country. But now we have them in our teams, working collaboratively with other skills. And remember, our deployment activities were controlled by the data center in a locked room. But now we have DevOps and even DevSecOps calling us to work together. And we can set the same expectation for an example in the physical world. An industrial feature team, if you will, as another example. Please note our team definition hasn't changed. Just the skills needed to deliver an entire slice of product, the full value chain. So now in this example, I need skills from product design, manufacturing design, a variety of engineering disciplines, supply chain, manufacturing, field service, etc. Now we still have some more to say about the teams, but what Cheryl and Angela and I thought might be helpful is, instead of going all the way through this, let's pause. Right? We're in this topic of what does it mean to be team-based, right? And we thought it'd be helpful if we just paused here for a bit and opened up the opportunity for discussion. Just some sample questions, but we can really address anything that's helpful regarding teams. Are your current structures working for you? Are they capable of delivering requests that are provided to them? And what are some things that could make that better? So Cheryl, Angela, it's okay if we just pause here and maybe see if we have any opportunity for some discussion.
Certainly. So are there any questions or thoughts? Those of you that are with us as attendees, do your current team structures work for you? Do they deliver as you'd expect them in your role, whether you're managers or scrum masters, or do you have anything that you guys would like to share at this point in time?
And feel free to unmute and talk. You don't have to put it in the chat.
Right. And if you'd like to, even use video when asking a question, that's great too. It's always nice to see a face.
I have a question. Oh, you can't hear me. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
I can hear you, Nicole.
Okay. Sorry. Are feature teams and the industrial teams the same thing as cross-functional teams?
Yes, that's the normalized term, cross-functional. I think sometimes what we see is that you might have teams that do have more than one skill, but they still don't have all the skills needed. And they could claim that they're cross-functional because they have more than one skill, but they may not have everything.
Okay, I was just wondering if they were the same or similar.
Yes.
So, thank you.
Peter, we have a question from Shelby. She wants to know if you can comment on whether full stack teams are more or less costly than more of a shared service model where skill sets are deployed from a pool.
Right. So maybe if I can just clarify for anyone who might not be familiar with the term, full stack, similar to Nicole's question, right? You have all the skills, and we're talking about a software environment. So you have database skills, middleware skills, front end skills, all on that team, where team members are interchangeable, basically, right? Every team member has those skills. So anyone on the team can work on a database. Anyone on the team can work on the front end. So the question is it more costly? Well, here's just some observations. One observation is there's the cost of delay that often doesn't get accounted for there. So if you have segregated skills where there's dependencies across teams and handoffs between teams, it increases the risk and increases the delay. If you have that full stack all present on the same team, then they should be fully capable of delivering a request on their own without dependencies with other areas. From a market perspective, what I'm seeing at least, full stack developers used to be more on the expensive side, but I think things there are leveling off, where companies are finding they could put job posts out there looking for full stack people, and there's a lot of them coming to their door that have that capability. So there's also a concern about payroll costs that I think has shifted to something that's more acceptable. Did that address the question, or is there more to that?
I have a follow-up to that. So as companies are looking at partnering with a managed service provider, and that the design and architecture for products and even the experimentation and wireframes, the crowdsourcing concept, if you will, as well, is done by their employees, but then the build and run are then outsourced to the managed service provider. Have you seen that been successful with an Agile team, and without that build and run team part of that cross-functional team?
So where I've seen some concern is the handoff between that initial design work and then the ones that are actually going to be doing the build. That handoff creates more opportunities for misunderstandings. So the people that did that initial work still have to stay very closely connected with the hired service, right? That's take care of actually creating it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other concern that needs to be addressed is that service provider, at some point, they're going to turn that code base, right? In this example, they're going to turn it back over to the customer, right? The original paying organization. And the ability to support that going forward, right? If we don't keep that service provider to also help us with support, now we have the same thing happening in the opposite direction, right? Now you have it coming back, and there needs to be effort put forth to make sure that we can support it and maintain it, right? With future changes. So, Jody, I guess overall, I would say that organizations sometimes make decisions that they believe are financially sound in terms of saving them cost. But you asked me, what do I see, right? I see oftentimes that there's a lack in understanding the full cost across the product lifecycle. And there's short-term cost gains, but it's more difficult to understand what the long-term potential expenses might be. Yeah.
And it does seem, as you're explaining it, to actually go backwards to the handoffs again, which Agile tries to get away from as well. So thank you. That was very helpful.
I did want to let you know that Shelby said thank you for your previous answer about full stack teams, Peter.
Thank you. Well, shall we continue for a bit?
I think so. Great.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. All right. So let's look at an example where the product is a physical device, right? And for those of you that are working in a software environment, you'll be able to see the analogy here, right? How it fits to a variety of environments. This is a cardiac monitor. That's the product. And this organization has deployed a component team model where we've divided our teams into product components where each component is not an entire slice of product, right? Completing the digital portion of the cardiac monitor, standing on its own, that doesn't bring that full slice value. So what would be the alternative? Well, of course, to create feature teams, or, as was mentioned, truly cross-functional teams, right? And by the way, just one more comment about the full stack, because we've run into this with people outside of software. We've worked on products where we might have had an electrical engineer and a mechanical engineer and a materials specialist, all working on the same team. And please know, we're not expecting that we're going to be able to be in a full stack environment everywhere we go. A mechanical engineer is not going to become an electrical engineer, and vice versa. They help each other and they work together, right? Of course. And they learn more about the other disciplines by working together. But we have found it's very rare. I would dare say we haven't yet seen it where you can get people that are truly full stack once you move into something like a physical delivery. So again, we're talking about creating feature teams. And yes, we are intentionally calling them that instead of cross-functional, because we want to verify that this team can deliver an entire feature that's requested. Now, in this case, the cardiac monitor has been sliced up a little differently. So notice how we've created something like the intravenous portion of the cardiac monitor. It's almost as if each of those areas are small products. I mean, I wouldn't say this is something that the company would pursue, but it's possible they could make the cart and transport aspect and sell that. Each one of these could be sold separately, potentially. Now, that might not be their business goal, but that also helps us understand more about this way of organizing our teams. Now, our interpretation from the Scrum Guide, and just to be clear about this, we view the Scrum Guide as a primary reference, not the only reference when we talk about Scrum. But when we look at the Scrum Guide, we interpret what's said there to indicate that you indeed need whatever skills are necessary to deliver a completed product. That's not in dispute. However, we've all been taught that you need to keep your teams together longer, long-standing teams. And there are very valid benefits to keeping your teams together longer. They learn how to work together better, they build confidence and trust, etc. And what we found is that the specific team configuration may need to change over time. Now that's something different. So years ago, in my first exposure to Scrum that Cheryl mentioned back in Wildcard days, as a startup company, we launched Scrum by the book. And when I say by the book, I mean like literally, by the book, right? This was like published in 2002 or something like that. This is all we had. Some of the original writings about Scrum. And we had to figure out a lot of this on our own. And as we built teams and we were growing, it was becoming more and more difficult to keep tabs on all those teams. And we found it helpful to create this map. This was hanging in my office. Each vertical row of sticky notes is a Scrum team. And every sprint, we would use this visualization to understand what team configuration changes were needed for that upcoming sprint. We changed team members quite a bit because we found needs were shifting. We have a situation where a particular team who didn't need any database work now all of a sudden has a lot of database work. Okay, where can we get a DBA from another area where maybe that DBA is not spending as much time doing database work, and move that person over to that first team? Now, it wasn't until we started going to conferences, to Scrum gatherings, that we were told, hey, you shouldn't do that. You need to keep your teams together longer. Well, we were just responding to the needs of the product environment we were in. And while we were wildly successful with our Scrum implementation, and who knew we were doing it wrong? But that's what was working for us. Now the team configuration here that we looked at from that cardiac monitor, notice that we have a manufacturing engineer as an example of a skill needed on all the teams. Well, of course, because these different aspects of the cardiac monitor are going to need to go to manufacturing. Is manufacturing represented by a full-time dedicated team member from the very beginning? Well, that might not be financially or technically reasonable. But what would be reasonable is to have that manufacturing engineer engaged from the very beginning. Engaged how? Well, we have some built-in opportunities. We have sprint planning, we have sprint reviews, we have daily scrums, we have product backlog refinement sessions. So here's what that might look like. Now, here, let me see if I can grab a pen just to point out a couple of things. This is time moving left to right, and you can tell because you can see those little circles moving left to right. Now, that's a lot of sprints, right? This is a long running delivery. Above that, we have these colored bands. And each band represents a different skill contribution. So for example, customer development, that's the skill that represents the ability to talk to our customers, explore the market, find out what's really needed out there. And then there's product design and development that people actually build, the testers, supply chain, manufacturing. Now, the thickness of each of those colored bands is meant to symbolically represent the amount of contribution expected from that skill. And if you look at customer development and product design and development and quality assurance and testing, you can see they're rather thick. In other words, there's a lot of contribution expected from those skills in the beginning. But if you look at supply chain and manufacturing at the beginning, they're not absent. They're present. We're just looking for a contribution and engagement, not necessarily full-time participation on a team. But if you look further down the timeline, supply chain and manufacturing are getting fatter. And in fact, when you get further along, manufacturing is probably taking the lead. But notice all the way at the end, we still expect that customer development, product design, testing, they will still be engaged because they need to make sure that that mass production is still going smoothly. They need to see if there's anything we've learned from how we have designed and built this that could change the way we mass produce the next time. Now, this model can work very nicely with the example of the NASA model, right? We still may need to account for the very important structural elements, such as what NASA has dictated. However, the change that we're going to make here is assessing the team structures by bringing all skills together and changing that structure over time. Now, we have a more practical example of this. This is a product delivery map with time moving left to right. You can see along the top, there's yellow stickies above the white sheet. And those yellow stickies represent quarters on the calendar. So you can see this is another long running delivery. This is from a company that makes computer chips. Now, this map alone is helpful as it allows everyone to see the big picture. It's stored in a conference room where anyone can drop by and inspect and make updates. But next, we add a form of Scrum of Scrums, where all the different areas from start to finish are required to participate. Now I want to restate that just to make sure you didn't miss this. All the different areas across the timeline, the full value stream, are required to participate. In this case, the organization is working out expectations on this roadmap and where different items might fall in this long-running endeavor, of course. And while they're having these daily discussions, a comment is made by the chip designers about the packaging that will be used for this particular computer chip. Now, the supply chain representative, who is now in this daily checkpoint, raises a concern about the planned packaging and says, hey, that packaging won't be available for another year. There's a global shortage. So we either get our order in now or consider different packaging. Now, in the past, that supply chain person wouldn't have heard about the packaging until it was time to manufacture the chip. But now they can recognize the need, prioritize that supply chain work earlier in the timeline, knowing that those procurement concerns need to be addressed ahead of what would have been a lengthy delay. And they added that to their timeline now to prevent what will eventually turn out to be a multi-month impact. So stickies were eventually recorded into a spreadsheet for retention purposes and printed out. But that simple approach of getting all areas engaged shaved 6 months off the final delivery. And it took people connecting on a daily basis, not a terribly intense structural change to the organization. Please note, we didn't ask supply chain to be part of a specific Scrum team, but to be engaged throughout. Now, later when we get closer to mass production, again, supply chain may end up leading the effort. We might not have as much representation from the designers. So we don't abandon the basic structural elements of Scrum. We're instead understanding how to interpret them for our environment. And we also maintain other expected artifacts and commitments, such as a well-maintained product backlog and a strong definition of done. For example, here's a workshop coming up with a definition of done. Just some odd things there. Notice like the third bullet point down, there's the BOM, the BOM. That's the bill of materials. In other words, you need to have the parts list. And right after that, you have assembly instructions. It just looks a little different, right? That's all. The definition of done is connected with our second main point about Scrum. Now, we've looked at the significance of what it means to be team-based. So let's now look at empiricism. Empiricism, steering the delivery by inspecting the actual product, often and early. Empiricism calls us to evaluate what we're proposing or theorizing and validate it through experience. So a design document cannot be validated through experience until what the design is intending to build is actually built and delivered at sometime later. Now, this also is a good opportunity to pause and just make sure, because one of the things I've found is that not everybody has a definition of done, or maybe doesn't even know, what the definition of done is. So before we get to this final section of empiricism and how that impacts our ability to deliver, Cheryl, Angela, another good time to take a breath and just check in with everybody.
That's good. I have a quick question. And then I'll be quiet. Let others ask their questions. In terms of having a documented and visible definition of done, sometimes those things are crafted and then they're put off in the artifacts, and sometimes they're taped up on a wall, which is great. But those things can change every sprint, correct? Because you may have performance one sprint, or you may have something else that needs to be added in. And do you find that that same concept works in this feature team, component team structure, or is it different?
So different areas bring different expectations for what might be needed. All right, so if we start by looking at something that's a little more straightforward, like a software delivery team, right? The people who are the testing experts, right? They're going to say, hey, don't forget, we need this documentation. Don't forget, we need this automation, right? They're going to add to the definition of done. So what we've discovered is that we want the definition of done to continually expand as we learn more about what's needed. But I think one of the common maybe missing points about the definition of done is not every request requires us to do every item on the definition of done. Right? There are some things that, if we go through the list and say, hey, do we need a build of materials for this? It's on our definition of done. Yeah, but for this particular request, we don't need that. So it acts as the checklist for everything that we might have to account for, but doesn't mean we have to. So I'm all for example, our manufacturing people adding things to the definition of done early, even though those things might not come up later, because it adds to the visibility of it.
I've seen also, I usually think of definition of done at a story level, but I've also heard it for a release or for a sprint. I think of a sprint goal, but where do you see the best application of definition of done, or is it applied at various levels?
Yeah, so you probably will hear different opinions than what I'm going to say. I have found the best application of done is at the request level. In other words, the product backlog level or the user story level. And when we get into other things like goals and visions and things like that, I think we start moving more into the area of acceptance criteria, than definition of done. I've been criticized for what I'm about to say. Some of my colleagues disagree with me. I look at the definition of done as our quality standard. It's the consistency that we want to see delivered over and over again. So while you can have a different definition of done for different things, I have found it more successful when there's a standard. There's like a baseline, the minimum that we're going to do, no matter what it is that we're delivering.
Thank you.
Quick question here with the various teams and the scrum of scrums where everyone gets together. Is that how that you get the cross-pollination of the definition of done, so that every team can bring in their I guess quality metric? Or is it at planning, or or are there just various times along the way that people bring those.
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't found that daily is where that definition of done gets revised. It could, right? It could happen haphazardly, but it tends to happen more, as the sprints are progressing and being planned out. So that example where we had the Scrum of Scrums, and by the way, we call it a Scrum of Scrums, but you could debate whether it really is a Scrum of Scrums, right? Yes, there's representation from the entire value chain, but we're not talking about team A and team B and team C sending a representative, right? It's a little different, but it fits. The word fits, right? The Scrum of Scrum fits. So in in addition to that, there are going to be times when it's going to be appropriate to have the different skills come to a sprint planning session. And there you'll see more of an opportunity for a definition of done. Come to the sprint review. Another great opportunity because someone is looking at what's been delivered and the team says, yeah, we met the definition of done, but another area of skill says, hey, have you considered this other thing over here? That's a good point. Maybe we should add that to our definition of done. So the Scrum of Scrums is one opportunity, but we also have other opportunities.
We don't currently have any other questions in chat, Peter.
Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and let's look at how our design can turn to something inspectable or empirical. Right. Again, we're going to stick with the physical example. Let's come back to some of the groundwork that needs to be accounted for. Right. We can still write user stories for our product backlog. This is taken from work being done by a COVID-19 volunteer group that is making CO2 sensors for classrooms so teachers can monitor air quality. Please note that the delivery requested is useful information. Right? No, I want to compare. That's information. It will come back to that idea. Is information something that we could request? We'll come back to that idea in just a bit. Please note we also have acceptance criteria. Right? Again, just looks a little different. With continued refinement, we can break down the original request into smaller pieces of delivery. Please note there are technical product backlog items that need to be addressed too. Remember, we see this in software when the developers raise technical items that need to be addressed, even if the product owner didn't realize the need themselves. If you're not familiar with the term, we have definition of done, but we also have definition of ready, which is the list of what we need to have in place before we can work on a product backlog item, right? Before the item is ready to be brought into the sprint, if you will. Note some of the considerations for ready, such as having parts ordered. So let's look more closely at what our product backlog items are requesting, right, and how we work through that. In normal Scrum fashion, we bring product backlog items into sprint planning. Acceptable items are decomposed into tasks, sprint backlog items. And while we're in the sprint, product backlog refinement continues, right? So we always have ready product backlog items for the coming sprint. Let's look more closely at the application of empiricism here. So this is something that we had to struggle with when we moved outside of software. If the purpose of each sprint is to deliver increments of potentially releasable product functionality, but that's the term you often hear, releasable or shippable. Well, it causes us to ask the question, what does releasable or shippable mean? For software, that's obvious, right? You need to show something usable to the customer, something that can go into production. But what does that mean if you're not delivering software? Well, our interpretation of a shippable increment, it's valuable. It increases our understanding of the product or the process, and it's inspectable. Now, as an example, working with a company that makes speakerphones for conference rooms. You remember in the old days when we used to have meetings in a conference room around a speakerphone? Their first iterations produced desktop speakerphones made of cardboard. They weren't functional, of course, but they addressed questions about form and fit that could be inspected. Another example, working with a company that makes cash machines for banks. When you go into a bank to deposit bills, the teller no longer sticks those bills into a drawer. Instead, they place the cash into a machine that flips through the bills, assessing the denominations and the quantities, drops the cash into a safe, and prints out a receipt. Now, this company that made those devices, those workstations, they had a firm market position in the United States, but even though their engineers were in Europe, international competition was threatening their livelihood. They could not get a new competitive product out the door literally for years. And we asked them to evaluate their biggest delivery problem. And they said, well, that's easy. We spend a year designing a workstation, have the customer review it, get their approval, and then spend the next 1 to 2 years building the workstation. When we show it to the customer, they tell us it doesn't work for them. Their plans have changed, or they forgot to account for left-handed tellers, etc. So this company changed their approach. In their first month-long sprint of product development, they set a sprint goal of having a physical representation of a workstation that they could then share with the customer, that the customer could inspect. Now, how did they accomplish this? Well, it started with a trip to the IKEA home furnishing store and a purchase of different sets of desk furniture. They then crafted a physical design, pictured here, that could be shared with the customer. The kinks were worked out. Several months later, we got this picture. Now, these are some of the team members in their factory with packaged product ready to ship. I'm going to read to you a quote from the product development manager. He said, "This is Agile and Scrum in hardware. 3 months, complete hardware, firmware, software revisions, overcoming major safety issues, R&D, diving in with manufacturing to get to done, and delivering to the customer 1 week early. I am beyond amazed." Now, they found other benefits too, such as an opportunity to reduce their field service costs. The power supply has always been placed in the back of the unit, making each service call very time consuming since the entire front of the workstation had to be taken apart to get to the power supply. And since the service techs are now engaged from the beginning, they had the opportunity to explain how most of their service calls are related to the power supply. Might we be able to move the power supply to the front of the workstation? And the designers reconfigure the workstation to allow for that, thereby cutting their service call costs. Now, there are many practices outside the rules of Scrum that make sense, right? Like the practice of keeping teams together longer. But that doesn't work best in every situation. There's pressure to conform to an unrealistic expectation of what that word releasable means, such as needing to complete a sellable product increment every sprint. So by adopting the thinking behind Agile, sticking to the rules of Scrum, there's only a few of them, but understanding how best to apply them in any given product situation, such as changing teams over time or seeing the value in delivering an inspectable increment or something that brings us more knowledge, we can realize the accelerated product delivery expectations of Agile. Our slogan is twice the product in half the time, which equates to 4 times the baseline product output. That's our goal. On a call with a company that makes road paving equipment, we were told your slogan should be 10 times the product. That's what we've seen. And 4 times the normal output is underestimating what's possible. So we're going to ship it. which means we're in a good place for some final questions here. And Cheryl, I know you and Angela have been tracking time, and I might not have been doing as good a job of that, but we are ready for an open conversation, if that still makes sense.
I think that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody can unmute and ask any questions.
I do see, oh, actually, someone sent a question to me. I'm going to assume it's okay to read that.
Sure.
Okay. Let's see. I haven't read it yet, so I hope I'm prepared to answer it. Peter, your point on feature versus component team triggered a thought. Feature teams enable an outcome of value, right? That's the focus. That's the approach. Component teams are more output focused on getting things done and can only realize value when all components integrate together. Oh, this is interesting. So it's not a question, but it's an interesting observation. Members could be less motivated in a component team environment. That's an interesting observation.
I would say that's totally true coming from someone who used to work on an integration team. That I worked on a team where I was part of so many different projects that I couldn't know or care even what every project was doing back in the old waterfall days. And I realized that was a big problem.
I like the concept of the feature team as well on when you talked about that cardiac unit, and maybe they'll sell one feature, but it also allows the product owner, the company, to see where one of the features might be behind in the market or a leader in the market, and how to bring those other features up to a level or have a breakthrough or something. It can really help you look at the cost components and the growth and strategy for those different features of that product or that device as well. So that was interesting.
Yeah, very interesting observation too. Yeah, focused attention on where it's needed.
Peter, Stephanie would like to know if you have experience working with Scrum teams who aren't focused solely on one project. So they may be working on multiple projects at one time.
Yes, that situation is on my list of common organizational obstacles that make it more difficult for products to progress. But I understand it happens. How do you deal with that? How do you address that? So the situation, if you're not an integration team, by the way, as was mentioned, right? If you're not a component team, because component teams will often find themselves in this situation, but if you're a feature team, if you're a cross-functional team, you might be in an environment where there are several products that need to be addressed, but any one of them doesn't warrant a full dedicated team. And that's where you might see this case, right? Where, hey, we need 2 items from product A and 1 item from product B and 3 from product C worked on this sprint. So when that happens, you're going to have different product owners. We need one funnel point. We need one product owner that can be the person that the team knows that's the one that's going to tell us what the priorities are. So we don't have conflicts across the different products. Now, this gets to the point of work being presented to the team. So you know that Scrum is based on Agile and Lean, and pull systems work more effectively, more efficiently than push systems. So we don't have that funnel point going to the developers and saying, okay, you need 2 from column 1 and 1 from column 2 and 3 from column 3. we'll get it done. No, the product owner presents all that work, and the developers pull what's reasonable into their sprint, because they may say, hey, product owner, you're asking us to do so much diverse work, we're not going to be able to get anything done. So we believe we can work on the first product and the second product, but we can't also add the third product in. So the organization has to be willing to support the self-managed team model, right, that we're talking about, and allow the team to tell us, what's practical, what can they accomplish. Now, I can tell you an example where I have found this to be more discouraging, right? And this example is that the company wants to work on 3 products at a time, but they don't have the discipline to prioritize them. So there's enough work, for any one of those products to warrant a single team. You can get 3 teams, but they only want to have 1 team, but they want the team to work on all 3 at the same time, just because they want to make progress on all 3. And that tends to backfire on us because of the cost of context switching. Gosh, I feel like that's a whole talk in itself that we could spend a whole session on, this business about teams thrashing across products.
Stephanie
And-
said she's building up Agile practice. So most teams she works with are component as their majority while working on a Scrum project with her. While also working on a Scrum project with her.
Mm.
And that, to me, this is so different because it's the context switching that those people have to do to have all those progress items with each of those projects is a
Yeah.
lot different in concept than, Peter, what you were mentioning, where you had role-based people, but they would move from one project to another and be full-time.
At least
Yeah.
for that sprint. Yeah.
Right,
We
right.
didn't, there was very limited shared resources. That was a very limited practice. It was limited to a highly specialized skill that where it didn't make sense to put that skill onto a team.
Right, and then
full-time.
but they still could focus on one thing every iteration versus these people
Right.
who are context switching on a daily basis. It's just not
Right.
realistic, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, what I've advised is, look, if you must make progress on all 3, have this next sprint working on product A, and then the next sprint product B, and the next sprint product C. It's still, has some context switching built in, but it's not as bad as everyday context switching.
I think a lot of that is usually management's attempt at utilization at 100%.
Bingo. So we have a very short directive about that when we're coaching organizations. What we encourage them to do: stop focusing on utilization, start focusing on output. Stop worrying about how many hours people are spending in a day. Focus on what are they able to accomplish.
And do they immediately say, that's great, Peter, we're going to do that?
It's amazing how few actually listen to that advice. Well, look. There's a philosophy, right? We started this by talking about how Agile is a way of thinking. It's a philosophy, and if you're familiar with your Agile principles, right? We're told to build motivated teams. All right. I mean, how do you build motivated teams? Well, you got to account for all these things that we're talking about. And when we view our Scrum team members, particularly our developers, when we view them the same way we view other resources, computers, software, right? just buy more, plug them in, interchangeable. I should, it's like a machine, right? I should be able to maximize the utilization of a machine. When it comes to people, thinking that we can maximize their utilization by counting hours, that's just a false way of looking at what the human experience really reflects, right? And I'm not suggesting let people come and go as they please, work as many hours as they want. I'm not going that far. I'm just saying that focus on getting the job done. What do they need to actually deliver something, and yeah, if they have to sit quietly for a while thinking about something, don't get uptight because they're not busy coding or testing. Discussing, is an activity. Sorry, I can go on this topic like for
Do you find
there's another question that popped up, I see.
Shelby said,
I opened my chat.
Yeah,
Shelby,
great.
go ahead.
Yeah, we have teams being asked to participate in innovation/discovery and provide the run org support for existing products. How about planning for capacity to staff innovation? So is the question having to do with how plan innovation into your capacity? I think that's the that's the idea of the question. If I'm wrong, just chat me a correction. So I would make a list of things that you can plan into your capacity. Innovation. I don't have this prepared, so it's off the cuff. Plan innovation into your capacity. Plan continuous improvement efforts into your capacity. Plan refactoring, right, into your capacity. Personal development into your capacity. So instead of saying, hey, you get to take a 2-day class a year, well, what if I had time every sprint to do some research or attend a webinar or something like that? So I'm not saying you should go and have all those things in your capacity, but depending on what your needs are, yeah, you might have a long list of things in your capacity. Production support, right, is another one. Taking time away from what's normally expected, building new products. So I'm in favor of that, but I wouldn't say apply that across the board. Right.
Cool.
Angela, did you have something?
I was trying to read you Shelby's question when you were reading it, and so I just let you go. That's all.
Thank you. I know I said I wasn't looking at the chat window, and I ended up opening it after I stopped sharing the screen.
No, that's totally fine.
We have I have another message, if I may. So something came to me directly.
Oh.
If I can read this. So you mentioned delivery in half the time with twice the final product, 4 times. Better expectations. So let's see. Expectations for several projects where I worked had been just getting to done. However, with a poor definition of done, too many workarounds were left to resolve, and there were too many items parked for future review. Hey, by the way, there's a term for that. You know the term. It's called technical debt, right? when you have all these loose ends that haven't been addressed. So if we view our product as a corporate asset, then all those leftover things are debts, liabilities, right, against the asset. Continuing reading, sadly, this resulted in realizing too late that these items would have been better addressed during the project. The idea was accepted that the final project cost and completion date might be the same using Scrum, but with fewer parked items and more effective workarounds, and most importantly, project teams learning more and confirming teamwork efficiencies going forward. Thank you, Manny. Yeah, that I find that so insightful. That, that some organizations are understandably focused on cost, but as we said earlier, over the entire product lifecycle, what about that cost, right? And what Manny just wrote there, the lessons learned from there. Cheryl, you had said, so did the organizations listen to you? Well, some of them, they have to go through a lessons learned. They have to go through a burned experience, before they'll accept the possibility that they might have to do things differently.
You find that the companies that you're working with, Peter, or have worked with in the past, eventually do come around to at least limiting the team's product intake to say like 2 projects. So then they have people's ability to switch from one to the other to make sure everybody's busy is still efficient, but they've reduced the number of projects they're working on.
Yeah. So I think, do I see that happening? I think it depends how I'm being asked to help. So if I'm being asked to help them launch new teams, then that's what's going to happen. They're going to be focused, right? Because it's part of the deal. It's part of like, okay, if you're going to ask me to come and help you launch, here's my checklist. I need a dedicated Scrum Master. I need some prioritized product backlog items. I'll help you do that if you need it. I need to understand what the budget is so that we don't overrun. Right? I need to know who my product owner is. They need to know what it means to be a product owner. And I need a dedicated team that's going to focus, right? However, if I'm asked to go in midstream, I have found it more difficult, right, to affect change there, because they've managed through this way and for some time, and I just my experience. Others have found maybe more encouraging experiences is that even though I might be asked to come in the middle, there's still a resistance to change because they have figured out a way that is satisfactory for them. And it seems to be more like they want to tweak things rather than restructure things. Now, here's one of the reasons why. In order to do that, it may very well require not just reforming the team, but it could impact the organizational command and control structure, leadership, who's responsible for what. And once you get into changing those things, if you don't have the top levels on board, it's going to be more difficult to change. Also understand that I'm like the cleanup guy, right? I don't get called in because everything's going great, right? I get called in because there are problems, but they don't always want to take the advice.
Are there any other questions or comments from anyone?
Hi, Peter. This is Julie. I was wondering if you have some resources that you often cite or, case studies that you'll bring in to help provide some, metrics or kind of tangible results for invoking some of this change. A lot of companies are resistant and they want to say, prove it to me. I want to know who else has done this, right? And what, what it's, why I should do it, right? Do you have some of those resources you typically use and provide to those that are having you come in?
Julie, gosh, I wish we had more permission to share. So I referred to several situations, several case studies in the presentation tonight. I didn't name a single company. I could have made it up. I didn't. I could have made it up. But the problem is that the companies that we work with, understandably, very strict NDA requirements. I'll tell you a story about one of those situations. We found some information about John Deere that was put out. You could find it. We didn't work with John Deere, but the coach that worked with John Deere, reported some amazing improvements, really impressive improvements. Well, I don't know exactly the legalities of it, but it appeared that maybe that person violated their NDA with John Deere, and the information was out already, right? So they couldn't do anything about it, but it was a bad situation for them, right? So where I'm reluctant to point you elsewhere because I can't testify to what's there. But for example, if you go to like the Scaled Agile Framework case study site, right? They have examples there where that's happened. Another very popular case study is the Gripen fighter jet, right? So owning the skies, it's called, is the article. You could go search for it. You could find that about how Agile was used to build a fighter jet. The Nokia story, which was the foundation for large-scale Scrum, 1,000 people working on a single product, hardware and software, all using Scrum together some years ago. But Nokia, right, is another one where information is publicly available. Someone just chatted, right? The Business Agility Institute is a great place to find case studies. So I can point to some. I just can't testify because I wasn't there,
Thank you.
So quick question, Peter. I was thinking about, the daily meeting where you've got this, really cross-functional teams, multiple teams. Is there ever pushback on the part of those people that are like what we used to call the below the lines? Like, you're not required all the time, but we want you to know at planning that we're going to need some of your help in this next sprint. Is there resistance on the part of those people? I mean, you talked about, they're committed and they're required. I'm assuming committed because you've been successful. But is there resistance or, any kind of like, I just can't make it. I have too much. These are like 5 or 6 teams and it's just too much. Is any of that?
Yeah. So when to do something like that, we have to go to the level that's high enough to dictate that's part of your job expectation. Okay. And to start, we're talking about 20 minutes a day. All right. Now, we might need that person more for something like sprint planning or review, but we start with 20 minutes a day. And we found it's difficult for people to push back on something like that when a senior level manager, right, the person that has the authority to say it, hey, I need you to do this. Let's at least test it out. Let's see how it goes. And let's see, do we really get value from this? And then once you start to realize some of those benefits, it becomes a little more easy, right, to get people on board, right? That they're not just asked to come, but we need them. They're valuable. They're helping us. Don't just come and be a fly in the wall. No, engage, participate, discuss. So, Cheryl, as you know, you need a good facilitator, right, to make sure that everybody is indeed getting value from that.
Thanks. So I see there's a comment from Daniel in the chat.
Yeah, in Agile software development, progress is usually measured by value delivered. How do you measure progress in hardware development? Same way. So how do you measure value delivered? There's different ways we can assess that. Much of the value assessments that we see are opinion based, right? They're based on smart business people who can look at the different items in the queue, discuss with the product owner, and then the product owner making an assessment, and we can assign numbers to represent value even, right? So you can actually accumulate value. Oftentimes it is indeed, though, opinion-based. If you want to move beyond opinion-based, now you have to go into other types of research and metrics, cost to build versus the potential benefit, impact on the marketplace, customer satisfaction. We want to retain our best customers, things like that. The same things that we'd asked in the software, we would ask in hardware, but one of the value assessments that tends to be understandably, right, more present in the hardware development space are things that you would never see in software. So for example, building a new set of earbuds, what material shall we use? Maybe the deliverable for a particular sprint would be to show 3 different types of materials that have been fully tested for weight, strength, cost. We have samples of them. So in the sprint review, you actually show the samples, and the user or the customer can look at the test results, pick up the different samples, and make a decision. How valuable was that for them, right, to have that? We'd have to have that discussion, why it was more valuable to do that, this particular sprint, than to maybe verify the USB-C functionality on it. So I view them very similarly, regardless of the product. That is an area that I think I would see a more uniform approach, regardless of the product.
Does anyone have any more questions? Is there interest in breakout rooms for socialization at this point? I know it's 6:30 right now, 6:31.
For some of you.
Or, yes, Peter, 7:31, that's right. But you're warm and we're not.
Peter, I'd like to just thank you for being here tonight and bringing this presentation to us and sharing it with us, and for making me hungry for lasagna.
That was my ultimate objective, my ulterior motive, was to promote Italian heritage.
I think it was a great analogy. I really, it was very simple. I love those stories when they tie something that everybody can understand to something that we work with or struggle with every day. So thanks for doing that.
I think it's really interesting too, Peter. So this, even though I've worked with component teams and with feature teams and component and feature teams at the same client, it's really interesting as I see some of the friction that occurred, at a previous client with a component team or a couple of component teams. They just weren't integrating with the feature teams, and so the idea of having that commitment for the organization to have people from these teams be interspersed or engaged in feature teams, or at least showing up on a very regular basis, is super critical. And I think that was truly one of the reasons why the component teams were not making great progress, besides being interrupted with context switching. And we had some management issues aside. We had some management issues in that same organization. So I think it's just really interesting that, oh my gosh, someone's making noise here. Sorry. Slightly rude teenager. I apologize, you guys. But I mean, I do, it makes a lot of sense how you've presented this, that had I known this like 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been great. But now I'm prepared for a go forward strategy. So thank you.
Well, Cheryl, and I think you have a very good point. Having feature teams isn't going to solve all of our problems, right? You still have dependencies across teams. You still have pressures, certainly, but it definitely moves us one step closer, right, towards successful deliveries.
So thank you. I have to echo Angie and the lasagna and thanking you for your time. So
I appreciate the opportunity very much. Thank you.
Hey, Peter, it's Manny. I just wanted to throw in there because I've heard you speak several times and attended your class, and I think and we've tried to work on projects together. I think one of the things that it's important to know is while it's about communication, and that includes listening as well as speaking, and it works in teams and better teamwork and follow up. The whole structure really works well together. I mean, you could have the greatest team in the world, you could have a bunch of people who communicate really well, but if they're not moving in the same direction, if they're not really learning from the experience they're going through, that's where that friction comes in. And I think, putting things on the board, looking at them, making sure you understand what you're doing with the next step, all of that really helps alleviate or minimize that friction, because you realize that you're all working on the same project as opposed to being separate and communicating at the end of the day. Or it's really it's really a great thing. And then I wish that more organizations would do it. I learned about it when I started doing consulting more, like there were more people out there listening as opposed to people who were structured and didn't want to change. So I think this is a great opportunity to move forward on things.
Yeah, thank you, and good observation. I like the idea of it's all got to be moving in the same direction. Yeah, Manny, I mean, you could use a waterfall approach, and if everybody's all moving in the same direction and understanding what we're doing and what the objectives are, you might have great success with that.
well, I'm going to ask one more time. I don't want to discount people that may want to go into a breakout room just for some conversation. I'm aware down to 16 people, so I know some people have had to leave. We could, stay here, or we could cut the group into like 3 smaller groups if there's any interest. I'd just like to hear from everyone if they want to do that, or if we just try to wrap things up. No. It does seem like this open discussion has been valuable and what people wanted, as opposed to being slammed in a room with me. So that's a good thing. So,
It's a different approach, right? Let's try something different.
it is. It's great.
Peter, I just want to add one more thing to what Manny was saying, right? So about the alignment, right? So one way to do that is making whatever we are doing purposeful, right? And the only way to get to that is what value we are trying to, or what problem are we trying to solve as a team. I think that will align everyone, right? So oftentimes it's about getting things done, right? Without really knowing what's the unified goal that we have in front of us, right? So.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. Thank you for stating that so clearly, Jagan. Thank you very much. Gosh, that whole business about just focusing on getting it done without understanding why you're doing it, that could also be very demotivating, can't it?
Great session today.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that comment. As I mentioned earlier, give us feedback. Let us know what kinds of things you'd like to see in the future. More of wisdom from people with experience like Peter. We've got things kind of lined up for the next 3 months, as I mentioned earlier. We've got Angie, correct me here on the title for what the SOHOTAs expect to speak about. I can't remember, and I don't have it in front of me. Like emotional intelligence, is that right? And
You know, I started an actual meeting draft. I'll pull it up here real quick.
okay. Let me get to share. Peter, don't leave. Don't leave us. Okay.
It's conscious leadership, and it's going to be Michael and Audrey Sahota both.
So that will be our March meetup. And then in April, we're going to be having Angie, our own Angela Gresto, talking on brain science. And then April is, I'm going to say this wrong. I don't remember the person's name, but from Vocablo. Is that?
Yeah, it's May. It's Mark Hundleby. He's a Vocablo artist and teaches classes, and it's the value of visual communication. And that, I know he's planning on that one being a bit interactive and actually teaching people how to do some of the drawings so that you can take those tools away and actually use them after the session. So it should be fun.
Cool. I am glad I am a member of your community.
We are glad you are. Yeah, we're really happy to see that there's interest in this revitalizing the Twin Cities, Minnesota, Fargo-Moorhead community and across the globe. We're trying to look at that silver lining of COVID and the expansion of